Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Rick, for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the production, distribution and sale of illicit drugs, which are some of the core activities undertaken by serious and organised crime groups in Australia. So drug trafficking generates massive profits for serious and organised crime groups. And then these funds are often laundered into the Australian economy, as we've heard Anthony explain. And then they're often reinvested into other criminal enterprises, other harmful types of crime that we've heard about during this conference. Things like cybercrime, human trafficking, buying illicit weapons, all kinds of harmful crimes that impact our community. So today I'm going to talk about the direct and consequential costs of serious and organised drug trafficking in Australia. I'm going to talk about how this figure represents the demand and supply for illicit drugs among Australians. And I'm also going to talk about the harm for individual users, but also for victims of drug-related crime in the community. See if this works. Cool. All right, so the costs associated with illicit drug trafficking were calculated as a part of our estimate of the overall costs of serious and organised crime to the Australian economy for the financial year 2023-24. This report is the fifth in a series of reports which estimate the cost of serious and organised crime to the Australian community. So the first of this was estimating the costs for the financial year 2013-14. And that was using a methodology that was developed from the really extensive literature around the costs of crime. And then we've repeated this estimate 5 times over the last decade, and we're now, as Anthony said, moving to an annual report that will be released every year. So to estimate the costs of serious and organised crime, we have to quantify the scale of these crimes in Australia. We have to identify the consequences and the harms linked to those crimes, and we also have to estimate the cost of those consequences. So that means that we can really only estimate the costs that can be identified and measured and quantified with a dollar amount. So as you can imagine, this is an underestimation of the true costs associated with serious and organised crime. There are many intangible, long-term costs that we just can't quantify. Things like intergenerational harm linked to illicit drug use, for example. So as I said, it's definitely an underestimation, but it's our best estimate that we have for the moment. So our estimate relies heavily on expert ratings to estimate the extent to which different types of crime are linked to serious and organised crime groups. So we know that not all illicit drugs are trafficked through serious and organised crime groups. There are certain drugs that might be manufactured or supplied through other criminal networks that are not serious and organised crime. For example, low-level dealers who might manufacture their own drugs or grow their own cannabis and then supply that to friends and acquaintances. So we use ratings by experts to estimate the extent to which each of the illicit drug markets is linked to serious and organised crime. So the aim of this series is not to directly compare the costs each time we do the report. Instead, we try and focus on just getting the best estimate that we have each time we do it. So we try and find new data that is stronger than the previous data that we've used. We try and integrate new data that has come out. We conduct our own primary research to fill the gaps in our estimate. So we just continually revise the methodology just to strengthen it each time. So for instance, I'll talk through this in my presentation, but we focus really heavily on improving our estimates of the cost of drug-related crime in this, in our most recent report. So while we can't directly compare the costs across each the broad costs across each time that we do it, we can compare more specific metrics that haven't been changed over the different variations of the report. Okay, so for the year 23-24, we estimated that serious and organised crime cost Australia up to $82.3 billion. And so this estimate includes the direct costs of serious and organised crime, which is in the blue. And this is the costs of primary activities undertaken by these groups to generate profit, things like illicit drug trafficking. We also have the enablers of serious and organised crime, which allow offenders to protect themselves and protect their profits, things like money laundering. We also have the costs of consequential serious and organised crime, and these are conventional crimes that occur as a consequence of serious and organised criminal activity. So relevant to this presentation, that includes crime committed by members of serious and organised crime groups to facilitate activities related to illicit drug trafficking, and it includes offences committed by people who are involved in the illicit drug trade. For example, people who are addicted to a drug and then commit acquisitive crimes to have money to then buy illicit drugs. But I'll explain this one a bit more as we go through. And then we also have the indirect costs, which is just in red. And this is the cost of preventing and responding to serious and organised crime. So these are indirect costs incurred by government agencies, such as law enforcement or criminal justice agencies, as well as the private sector, so households and businesses. So of all the primary activities undertaken by serious and organised crime that we were able to measure, illicit drug trafficking is by far the most costly to our economy. So it represents 39.5% of the total direct costs of serious and organised crime. So these direct costs include the money that Australians spend buying illicit drugs that doesn't therefore enter the legitimate economy. It includes the human costs of illicit drugs, which includes the medical costs and the lost productivity of people who use drugs, and also the consequential costs linked to serious and organised drug trafficking, which, as I said before, is the conventional crimes that are committed as a consequence of the illicit drug trade in Australia. So the largest loss to the Australian economy incurred by illicit drugs comes from just the sheer amount of money that Australians spend buying illicit drugs every year. So most of these funds are lost to the economy, which means that they are not spent in legitimate businesses. Instead, they're channelled into serious and organised criminal activity. So to estimate how much Australians spent buying illicit drugs in this financial year, we use the latest data from the ACIC's National Wastewater Monitoring Program. Amber already gave an excellent overview of this program, so she's done some of the work for me. But this report estimates the total annual street value and the total consumption in kilograms and tonnes for drugs consumed by Australians. And this data is up on screen. So we then applied our expert ratings to estimate the proportion of each of these drug markets that are linked to serious and organised crime, which is in the third column. So this allowed us to calculate that in the year 23-24, Australians spent $9 million on methamphetamine, 2.2 billion on cocaine, 148 million on MDMA, and 284 million on heroin. So cannabis wasn't reported in the most recent wastewater report, but we estimated that based on prior consumption, Australians spent about $355 million on cocaine in that same, cannabis in that same financial year. And that is specifically linked to serious and organised drug trade. So in total, we estimated the street value of drugs consumed by Australians just for these 5 drugs trafficked by serious and organised crime groups to total $10.9 billion in that financial year. And as I said before, this is likely an underestimation. We know that there are many other drug types that are trafficked by these groups. So as I said, this is an underestimation. And this number alone, the amount of money that is spent on illicit drugs, can only tell us part of the story when it comes to understanding the illicit drug market in Australia. So since the prior financial year, that's 22-23, the total volume of drugs consumed for methamphetamine, cannabis, MDMA and heroin increased by 34%. But despite this, the total amount of money that Australians spent buying illicit drugs actually decreased across this same time period. So I have the comparison for methamphetamine up on screen. And just to note, this is all consumption, not serious and organised crime related to methamphetamine. But as you can see, there was a 21% increase in the quantity of drugs in terms of the kilograms, but there was a 15% decrease in the total expenditure on methamphetamine. So how do we make sense of this? So one explanation is that there's been a decrease in the overall price for these drugs. There's really good national data from the UNSW illicit drug reporting system, which shows that the price of a gram of crystal methamphetamine has decreased steadily over the last 5 years. And between 23 and 24, it dropped from $380 for a gram to $300 in that 1 year time frame. So much like legal regulated markets, illicit drug markets operate with the same principles of supply and demand. So when a drug is readily available and supply is high, the average price can decrease due to greater competition between different dealers and different suppliers. And then this can lead to an increase in drug use in the community. Conversely, when supply is reduced, for example, by a disruption to the supply chain or law enforcement activity, dealers must compensate by rising the price, and they often cut the product with different agents, so they lower the quality of the drug. And more expensive, less high-quality drugs are less appealing, and less people buy them. So there's some really good evidence showing this relationship between lower prices in drugs and increased drug use. So there's this really good systematic review by Jason Payne and his team, and they examined the price elasticity of demand for drugs. And they found that a 10% decrease in the price of illicit drugs resulted in an increase in demand of approximately 9%. There's also another really good review by Caitlin Hughes, which examined the evidence across 36 Australian and international studies, and they found an inverse relationship between the price of illicit drugs after adjusting for purity and the rate of harm. So they showed that lower prices were associated with higher rates of overdose, crime in the community, and treatment admissions for people who use drugs. And so I think a really interesting example of this demand-supply dynamic playing out in real life, but in the opposite direction of what we're currently seeing, was this real-life experiment that we saw with COVID-19. So there was a really significant disruption to the illicit drug market that occurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. And so we had an AIC paper that compared specifically the Perth methamphetamine market in January and February of 2020, and then again in April and May of 2020. So as we all unfortunately remember, COVID-19 led to really significant border closures interstate and overseas. There were really major disruptions in mail, freighting systems, shortages of household supplies, limits on social gatherings, all of which played a role in disrupting the illicit drug market. So up on screen, we just have ratings that were provided by police detainees about their perceptions of the methamphetamine market in Perth at the time. So as you can see, there was a really significant drop in the availability of methamphetamine, as you can see up on the graph. So, and there was also a really significant decrease in the quality of methamphetamine at the same time. And we also saw a really significant increase in the price of methamphetamine. So for a point of methamphetamine, it went from $30 to $100 a point. So I think it's really important to understand the trends in supply and demand for illicit drugs when we try and understand the harms that come from illicit drug use in the community. And perhaps the most visible category of these harms which is directly linked to Australians' consumption of illicit drugs, are the medical and healthcare costs of treating injuries related to illicit drugs, treating drug dependence, and also the costs of drug-related deaths as well. And lost productivity, in particular, takes into account the inability of people who use drugs or are dependent on drugs to contribute to the economy. So being unable to work means that they are unable to pay taxes into the economy due to illness or drug dependence or disability or death. I think it's really important to emphasise that these lost productivity costs are actually a really significant part of the costs of illicit drugs, particularly when you talk about young people who potentially lose decades of employment and income due to illicit drug use. So we estimate these costs using data on the number of drug-related deaths from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and drug-related injuries from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So in the year 23-24, the medical costs totalled $1.6 billion and the lost output costs were $6.5 billion. So together, these are about $8 billion for that financial year. And we can also compare to the previous financial year. So these costs have increased about $1 billion in that time frame. And I think this makes sense given what I said about these healthcare harms being inversely related to the price of illicit drugs. So these represent the direct harms of illicit drugs on the individual users. But as we know, illicit drugs also cause significant social and economic harms in the wider community. And again, especially when we consider the conventional crimes committed as a consequence of serious and organised drug trafficking. So these include acquisitive offences by people who use drugs to obtain money so they can buy illicit drugs, and other offences, things like drug-related violence or driving under the influence of drugs. So our estimate of the consequential costs of illicit drug trafficking, was a major area of improvement for this report. We updated the methodology in how we estimated the proportion of all conventional crimes that is linked to illicit drug trafficking, and that was based on new primary research that we conducted. So this Trends and Issues paper, this estimates the proportion of specific criminal offences that are attributable to drugs or alcohol in Australia. So the report used data from interviews with over 2,200 adults who were detained by police at police watchhouses or police stations around Australia during 2019. So the data was collected at 5 sites around Australia, including Adelaide, Perth, Brisbane, and 2 sites in Sydney. So detainees were asked about their use of alcohol, methamphetamine, cannabis, heroin, and MDMA, and they were also asked about the extent to which those drugs played a role in their offending for which they were currently being held. So this allowed us to calculate the proportion of all detainees who were charged with a certain offence who attributed their offending to illicit drugs. So from all the detainees who were interviewed, about 45% of all detainees attributed their offending to drugs or alcohol, and 33% attributed their offending to an illicit drug. And most commonly, as we can all guess, it was related to methamphetamine, which reportedly played a role in about 28% of all offences. And we also asked detainees about the reason why this drug contributed to their offending. 2/3 of them said that it was because they were high at the time of their arrest, and most others said that it was because they either needed money to buy drugs or because they were withdrawing from drugs. We also found that detainees who were dependent on an illicit drug were much more likely to attribute their offending to illicit drugs than detainees who were not dependent. So we can also compare these data to data that were collected through the same national survey 10 years earlier in 2009. And as you can see, most notably, the proportion of detainees who attributed their offending to alcohol significantly dropped and nearly halved from 30% down to 16% during that time. And at the same time, the proportion of detainees who attributed their offending to methamphetamine increased from 6% to 28%. So a really significant change over that time. So we obtained charge data directly from police records. So we were able to categorise each detainee's offending based on their most serious offence type, and we used the ANZOC classification for that. So this allowed us to estimate the proportion of different types of offences that were attributable to different drugs. I've also put in bold just the particular offences that we will use for the costing estimates in the next section, so just to emphasise those. But as you can see, illicit drugs contributed to offending in a large proportion of detainees, particularly those charged with dangerous or negligent acts, unlawful entry with intent, which is burglaries, theft, homicide, and acts intended to cause injury, which is things like assault. So then we use the proportions from that Trends and Issues paper to then estimate the total number of criminal offences in Australia that are attributable to illicit drugs, specifically linked to the serious and organised drug trade. I just want to explain as well that the proportions of offences here are lower than what you would have seen for the Trends and Issues paper, and that's just because those attributions were for any illicit drug use, whereas these proportions have been adjusted based on the degree to which we believe each drug market is linked to serious and organised crime, so they're a little bit lower. But we tallied together all the offences at a state and territory level for the financial year 23-24. We also added multipliers to account for offences that were unrecorded or unreported to police. And so as you can see up on screen, we have estimated the number of offences that are linked to serious and organised drug trafficking in Australia for that financial year. And it totalled $4.5 billion. So, the direct and consequential costs linked to serious and organised drug trafficking in Australia includes the $10.9 billion that Australians spend buying illicit drugs, includes the $8 billion on lost productivity of people who use drugs and the healthcare and treatment costs, and also the $4.5 billion in consequential costs. So all of these together, we can estimate that illicit drug trafficking linked to serious and organised crime groups was $23.4 billion in that financial year. So quite a lot. Using this data, we can also, for the first time, work out approximately how much of these costs are incurred by different states and territories. So again, we use the data from the National Wastewater Monitoring Program to do this. So that reports the consumption for each state and territory. So this allowed us to calculate the proportion of the national drug market that is represented by each jurisdiction. And as you can see up on screen, the most significant costs are incurred by the more populated states, including $7.3 billion for New South Wales, $6.4 for Victoria, and $4.6 billion for Queensland. I also want to just explain that this $23.4 billion is also, again, definitely an underestimation because it doesn't account for the indirect costs that we spend preventing and responding to illicit drugs. So that includes the law enforcement costs, the costs of criminal justice systems, border force, other government agencies that focus on crime or illicit drugs, and again, also the indirect costs incurred by the private sector, so businesses, households, individuals, for example, things like physical security measures. So all of those costs are not accounted for in the $23.4 billion. It's really difficult to disaggregate the cost to the public sector that we can attribute to each different type of crime. But as I said earlier in the presentation, we know that illicit drugs account for about 39.5% of the direct costs of primary activities by serious and organised crime groups. So if we apply this same percentage, this 39.5%, to the total costs of prevention and response. This gives us a really kind of ballpark, crude estimate that Australia probably spends an extra $9 billion preventing and responding to illicit drugs. So this would take our total cost to over $32 billion in 1 year for the serious and organised illicit drug trafficking trade. Okay. So the cost of serious and organised drug trafficking in Australia is clearly staggering, but these figures alone, they don't tell us the most effective strategy for reducing these costs, but they can help us identify priority areas that could be targeted by law enforcement policymakers, these really high cost areas. We can see from this data that estimating the total amount of money that Australians spend buying illicit drugs is really valuable information. It allows us to understand the proceeds of crime from illicit drugs that potentially enter the legitimate financial system. And again, these are often reinvested to other criminal activities as well. However, the overall expenditure on illicit drugs is only one measure of the drug market. It really has to be understood in terms of supply and demand for illicit drugs among Australians. So even when the overall expenditure on illicit drugs decrease, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a reduction in consumption or reduction in the harms linked to illicit drugs. In fact, it can mean that the price of illicit drugs has gone down, which, as I showed earlier, can mean that people are buying more drugs and is associated with an increase in things like crime, treatment admissions, those healthcare related harms. Which again, we estimated to cost $8 billion in that one financial year. So I think our data supports other evidence that increases in demand for illicit drugs is linked to higher rates of crime in our community. So of the crime that is committed as a consequence of illicit drugs, which again, we estimate cost about $4.5 billion in that financial year. We found that most of this crime occurs because the drug users are experiencing negative effects of the illicit drugs. So things like intoxication or withdrawal, or they need money to buy illicit drugs. And again, detainees who are dependent on illicit drugs were much more likely to attribute their offending to illicit drugs than those who are not dependent. So there's definitely a relationship there in terms of drug dependence. So I think this highlights the importance of reducing demand for illicit drugs through things like demand reduction programs, which we hope would reduce drug-related offending in the community as well. And I also just wanted to quickly flag this other AIC review, which outlined some really strong evidence about demand reduction programs and the cost effectiveness of these programs. So these programs, they aim to help people to reduce or stop using drugs, as well as prevent people from taking up drug use in the first place. And this review found that on average, demand reduction programs produced a return on investment of $5.4 for every dollar spent, so very cost effective. So just to finish up, we are already underway crunching numbers for our next cost of SOC report, and we'll continue to strengthen and revise our methodology for estimating these costs. But I really hope that today I've demonstrated that this approach that we take for the report, which is using multiple different complementary metrics and different indicators to understand specific types of crime, I think it's a really valuable approach because it gives us insight into different drivers of crime and it helps us to understand the full picture of what's going on. So thank you for listening. As Rick said, my name's Alexandra Voce. Please feel free to send me an email after the conference if you'd like. You can also download a copy of our Trends and Issues paper with the Q&R code. And I also put a copy of the Cost of SOC in everyone's conference bag so you can all have a read. Yep, that's it. Happy to take questions.